Oh, hello there, magpies. It's nice to meet you here. I didn't fancy I didn't realize I would run into you here. I do beg your patience here, and I thank you for turning up early, but I do need to take just a moment to take care of some admin. And while I do, why don't you take this opportunity to tell me about your day? Oh, really? Is that so? Oh, and what did you say to her? And he was there? And they were roommates. Wow, that's so interesting. Uh-huh. Interesting. Well, I'm sure it was all for the best. But enough about you. What about me? You see, today, magpies, I'm taking part in a interesting, something I've been wanting to do for some time. You know how when you want to feed a dog a pill that's good for it, you wrap it in cheese so it will, so that it will swallow it, so it won't spit it out. A lot of dogs are too clever to fall for that trick, but nonetheless we persist. Perhaps doing this same thing expecting a different result being the definition of insanity is the latest symptom in my madness. For while I enjoy very much streaming video games, my true passion is education. And while I draw you in with the gaming, I then push the knowledge, something I think that we can all enjoy. So, today I will be doing my first ever research stream. We'll be covering the Leaders of Civilization 6. This is one of my favorite video games of all time, and I can kind of trace my love of history back to my experience of playing the very first Civilization games. They were kind of beyond my ability to understand, and to learn, and to really play, being quite young when I first picked them up. But the questions that they naturally led me to ask my parents expanded my consciousness. For example, I would be wanting to know who I should play as, and I'd go down the list and I'd be like, America, yeah, I know them. I've got an American friend at school. Aztec, never heard of them. So I'd be like, Mum, who are the Aztecs? And she'd be like, well. And then she would tell me about colonialism, about genocide, about the settling of the Americas and the parallels to the settling of Australia, leading to the stolen generation. And I would be like, my world was just blown. So I'd be like, oh cool, okay, I'm gonna play the Aztecs and I'm gonna kill Spain. That's my job. And America as well. And then 2,000 years into the game, I'd be looking at what I want to build next. And I'd see there would be a world wonder, and I'd be like, well, I don't know what this is, so I'm going to ask my mum, see if it's worth spending 50 turns to build it. And I'd be like, Mum, what's the Manhattan Project? And she would say, well. And then we'd have to get into a conversation about World War II and my grandfather's role in it, about the nuclear bombs, about mutually assured destruction of the Cold War, and the fact that we were only minutes away from annihilation, fiery hell at any point in our lives. And I'd be like, holy shit. But mum, only the good guys have the bombs, right? And she'd be like, well, you know how we talked about how some folk killed the people who lived in America? Yeah, the people who live there now, they have the most. But hopefully we won't be doing something quite so intensive, though if you do have your mind blown, I will be very happy with that. We're going to be exploring the historical figures behind the leaders, as I mentioned before, and we're going to go through them alphabetically. You see, there are a whole lot of leaders, so maybe this will have to be an ongoing project. So, we'll start. Our first couple will be extremely easy since they are very comprehensively written about and we won't have to question the sources that much. But first on the list, alphabetically. Somebody who should be familiar to all Americans watching. I mean, surely he's known to most people, at least in Western countries. Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter. No, not him, but you know. We'll be interested to see if he does kill any vampires. Alright, so we're going to start on Wikipedia, and the thing about Wikipedia is not your one-stop shop for research. A lot of people treat it that way, but there is I remember a very old Penny Arcade webcomic which sort of expressed the problems with Wikipedia. It showed Skeletor editing the entry for He-Man, going, He-Man is a big dumb poopy head. Now, while Wikipedia does have moderation, it is not ideal. If you go to Wikipedia enough, you will know that it is full of narrativization, sources needed, dead links, bad references. But we're going to look at that today. And hopefully we can all learn some stuff together. I know I'm looking forward to learning some stuff. So, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States from 1861 to 1865. So, Australia would have been settled for some 80 years when he came in. Alright, so there's going to be a lot of reading, a lot of me talking. So we're going to see how I manage. Alright. Abe Lincoln. For the jazz musicians, see Abe Lincoln here. Well, that's kind of cool. I already just learned something. So, Abraham Lincoln, born in 1809. He was a lawyer, a politician, and a statesman, the 16th president. Wikipedia, order of US presidents. List of presidents of the United States. Alright. Now you'll notice that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And yet he freed the slaves. That doesn't sound like a very Republican thing to do. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than I understand, but the positions of the two parties flipped at some point. We could do a research stream into that, or perhaps a video essay on that later, but I don't want to get too much into the details there. So, James Buchanan. Wow. Just to think, like, you know, Abraham Lincoln being the one who, you know, led the Civil War and freed the slaves and everything. Buchanan, I've heard of him. Who the fuck's heard of Pierce, Fillmore, Taylor, Polk? I think I've heard of Tyler. Definitely heard of Harrison. Buren. Quincy Adams, yeah, definitely heard of him. And then Johnson, Grant. Oh, he was the guy who led the forces, the Union forces. Garfield. Alright, so let's get back to Lincoln. We don't want to spend too much long on him. So he was born in poverty. Probably we could probably relate that to his understanding of the slave experience. You know, empathy breeds better people, and suffering. I find that people who have never suffered sort of don't really understand the world as well as those who have. That could be my personal bias, but it's what I've experienced. He was self-educated. Okay, that's pretty cool. Raised on the Indiana frontier, and he became a lawyer for the Whig Party. The Whigs were once this sort of the more progressive of the British-styled parties. Wait, no, the Whigs were conservative, weren't they? The United States. Alongside the slightly larger Democratic Party, four presidents were associated with the Whigs. Was critical of Manifest Destiny. That's interesting. It disliked strong presidential power, preferring congressional dominance, advocated modernism, meritocracy, and the rule of law, protections against tyranny, and vigilance against executive tyranny. Well, we could fall into the trap here of relating that to modern politics and what it means, but it's probably not that useful. We see the Whigs themselves adopted the word conservative, which they associate with law and order, social caution, and moral restraint. So that's a whole rabbit hole that we can best summarize by saying that the meaning of terms changes over time, and particularly political terms, they can, well, the longer they're stretched out, they can kind of become incoherent. I mean, does conservative truly mean law and order these days when you have conservatives practically lining up to go to jail? Social caution. I mean, replace caution with like bigotry and fear and moral restraint. What kind of moral restraint do we really see among conservative leaders these days? Sure, moralism is something that they weaponize. But anyway, I knew I was going to get into a rabbit hole talking about American politics here. It kind of dominates the conversation. So, back to Lincoln. He was a moderate Republican. So let's get to his life. Born in a log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm. Well, they've turned into slightly nicer than a log cabin now, by the look of that. So he's English stock, I guess you could say. Probably don't need to know too much. He worked as a farmer, cabinet maker, and carpenter. Excellent. He understands. Working class. Very important things for a leader. His mother died in 1918, so he would have been only 9 years old. That's sad. That's gotta have messed him up. And then he was 19. She gave his sister, who was left in charge of the household, an 11-year-old in charge of the household. He gave birth to a stillborn son. Wow, so he had a really sad upbringing. He was largely self-educated. His formal schooling was from itinerant teachers. Itinerant means kind of like wandering around without clear routes. He learned to read, but probably not write at age 7. Age 7. He was strong and athletic and adept at using an axe. Ah, Vampire Slayer. An active wrestler. And won a reputation for strength and audacity after winning a wrestling match with the renowned leader of ruffians, known as the Clary's Grove Boys. Let's see, what's the source on that? 35. 34, rather. Lincoln. New York, New York, Simon and Schuster. Let's see where that takes us. Ah, it'll be an autobiography. Okay. Pulitzer Prize winning. It's always good to check up on the sources. I didn't have any reason to suspect that source was doing a dodgy. I just thought it was funny. Okay, the Clary's Grove Boys. Grove Street for life. So basically, he grew up playing GTA San Andreas. I wonder if there's a reference there. I wonder if the video game makers made a reference there. Alright, so March 1830 would have been 21. Fearing a milk sickness outbreak. Milk sickness is a poisoning from milk from cows that have eaten the white snakeroot plant. Okay. Fair enough. So they moved to Illinois. Macon County? God, I love the look of some of these old colonial American buildings. They're kind of cool. Okay, he was asked how he came to acquire his rhetorical skills. Well, he was a lawyer. Studied Euclid. That's a good start. His first romantic interest was Anne Rutledge. She died of typhoid. Met Mary Owens. And then Mary Todd. So it looks like... looks like they got married while actually preparing for the nuptials. He was asked where he was going and replied, "To hell, I suppose." I can only assume he was talking about his anxiety, not the future marital bliss. So, his oldest son died of tuberculosis. His next son died of a fever. The next one survived his dad, but died of heart failure. Oof. Wow. I wonder if this was like pretty common for the time or if it was particularly tragic. He would bring his children to the law office, and his law partner remarked that he wanted to wring their little necks and yet kept his mouth shut. Probably good. Lincoln suffered from melancholy, a condition now thought to be clinical depression in after the death of the sons. Mary struggled with the stresses of losing her sons, and Robert, that is the oldest son, committed her to time in an asylum for a time. Christ. Wow. Wow. Okay. So he worked at a general store where he met his first vampire. He served in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War. Oof. Alright, so he probably Yep, killed a whole bunch of Native Americans. And he planned to become a blacksmith afterwards. He purchased a store on credit. Blah, 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 da, 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 da. In his first campaign speech after returning from military service, Lincoln observed a supporter in the crowd under attack, grabbed the assailant by his neck and the trousers, and tossed him. Tossed him where? I suppose it doesn't really matter. Okay, so he joined. He was a postmaster and a county surveyor. And then we had a state house campaign where he succeeded, but he joined the Illinois House of Representatives for Sangamon County. He was admitted to the bar. In the House of Representatives, he favored economic modernizing in banks, tariffs to internal improvements, railroads, and urbanization, working on infrastructure. That is excellent. He spoke against the Mexican-American War, which he imputed to President James Polk's desire for military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood. That is a good quote. Okay. He pledged to only serve one term in the House. He returned to his law practice. Became a prairie lawyer. After a murder case, which is not really relevant to the story, I don't think, he emerged as the leader of the Republican Party to the backdrop of the debate of the status of slavery in the territories. Related to the failure of the Compromise of 1850. We are now 1854. So he would be in his 40s, I suppose. So during his Peoria speech in 1854, Lincoln declared his opposition to slavery. He said that the Kansas Act had a declared indifference, but as I must think, a covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. I cannot but hate it. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world. So the Whigs were split on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the slavery issue. Lincoln wrote, I think I am a Whig, but others say that there are no Whigs and that I am an abolitionist. I do no more than oppose the extension of slavery. The new Republican Party was formed as a Northern party dedicated to anti-slavery, drawing from the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party. See, this is an interesting quote. I'm going to meditate on that and think about what that means. So I think he was kind of playing to the middle of the party, is what that sounds like. He He didn't want, says here, he didn't want the party to become a platform for extreme abolitionists, which is very much the status quo. The most successful revolutions happen generationally, gradually, incrementally, which is great if you have that time to do it. You're not, back against the wall against potential rising fascism or, a climate crisis. You weren't going to defeat Hitler incrementally and generationally. All right. So, to more political up here to more political tension over the issue of slavery, blah blah blah. We're going to fast forward a little bit because we're getting bogged down here a little bit. We don't want to worry too much about this. We know ultimately he was elected as president. No ballots were cast for him in 10 of the 15 slave states, and he only won 2 of 996 counties in all the southern states. Yeah, an omen of the impending Civil War, very much so. He won with 39.8% of the vote. Wow, in a 4-way race. But he got decisive victory in the Electoral College. So the South, as you can probably imagine, the South wasn't happy about this. We got this little picture here. Oof. Yeah, let's leave that. Okay, so a whole number of states then decided to leave the Union. 6 of these states declaring them to be a sovereign nation, the Confederate States of America, and adopted a constitution. The upper South and border states initially rejected the secessionism, but so attempts at a compromise followed. Lincoln said, "I will suffer death before I consent to any concession or compromise which looks like buying the privilege to take possession of this government, to which we have a constitutional right." Based. Okay. So we tried some middle-of-the-road amendments. There was the Corwin Amendment, which he kind of tacitly, sort of, not directly, but implicitly supported, which would have actually protected slavery in states where it already existed. But obviously that didn't work out, and we're probably better off. Well, we're definitely better off for it. And we reached the Civil War. I'm not going to get too deeply into the Civil War strategy and everything, and the battles. So here we have more of the politicking. This is something that is often left out of a lot of narratives, but it is important to understand, and it's not the ethical idealism that we would perhaps want from our heroes, particularly when a leader like Lincoln is so narrativized. He said while he wanted all men to be free, his first obligation was to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. So basically, he is outlining that he has, his service is to the country first, and this is the basis of his entire ethical framework. So it is at least he is ethically consistent, even if he is not the based, red-pilled, anti-slavery hero we might wish. We might remember him as. But at the end of the day, his actions, they speak. Okay. So he ran for re-election, blah, blah, blah. So after the war, Lincoln seemed to take quite a conciliatory approach, at least in rhetoric, to reunite the two halves of the country, North and South, aiming to rebuild the nation at one. Results varied. But he did keep as an absolute that they had to abolish slavery as part of Reconstruction. And of course, the Democrats, who were very pro-slavery, accused Lincoln of using the military to ensure his and the Republicans' political aspirations. You've heard this before. Now it's sort of the Republicans saying, "Ah, but you wish to do good things, but the good things are part of your political platform. Therefore, doing good things is partisan and biased, and therefore not good." Yeah, it's a funny old world we live in. Well, radicals denounce his policy as too lenient. Yep, we've seen this before as well. It's nice to see things throughout history that run fairly consistent, where you can recognize as it was, so it shall be. Ut erimus, ut fuimus. So Lincoln kind of not sitting on the fence, but trying to sort of straddle the two parties, tried to bring the different groups together. Oh, this is going to be a spicy paragraph. I can feel it. Lincoln's experience with Native Americans started early as the killing of his grandfather in front of the family. Oof. Okay, well, Black Hawk War, he saw no combat. Policy towards Indians was based on politics. Ooh, he sent Confederate prisoners of war to fight Native Americans. Yikes. That's optically not ideal. Anyway. We don't want to get tied down in that. So his general theory of presidency was based on effecting laws while leaving the Congress to legislate. He only vetoed 4 bills. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of Supreme Court appointments. His philosophy on court nominations that we cannot ask a man what he will do, and if we should, he should answer, and if we should, and he should answer us, we should despise him to it. Therefore, we must take a man whose opinions are known. Yep, that's solid. Okay. So then we reach the bit we all know. John Wilkes Booth was a well-known actor and Confederate spy from Maryland. After attending an 1865 speech in which Lincoln promoted voting rights for African Americans, Booth hatched a plot to assassinate the president. So he planned to assassinate Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, who we saw earlier with the badass sideburns. At the last minute, Grant decided to visit his children in New Jersey. Just before he was assassinated, Lincoln signed legislation establishing the U.S. Secret Service. Oh, that is irony. Booth entered the back of Lincoln's theater box. Kind of funny that like a booth is like a you describe a theater box as a booth. And he fired up the back of Lincoln's head, mortally wounding him. His guest, Major Henry Rathbone, momentarily grappled with Booth, but Booth stabbed him and escaped. Lincoln was taken across the street to Peterson House, remained in a coma for 8 days, and then died on April 15th. Two weeks later, Booth, refusing to surrender, was tracked to a farm in Virginia and was mortally shot by Sergeant Boston Corbett and died on April 26th, 11 days after Lincoln. There had been orders that Booth was to be taken alive, so Corbett was initially arrested to be court-martialed, but he was later declared a patriot and the charge was dismissed. Fair enough. So, Lincoln is believed to have had depression, smallpox, and malaria. He took 4 blue mass pills which contained mercury to treat constipation. Oh. So if he hadn't have died then, he would have had a very slow deterioration and madness. So yeah, what can we say about Abraham Lincoln? Well, he strikes me as an ethically consistent president, which you would think that would be the standard, but we have sort of strayed away from that in recent years. Part of that is the growing incoherence of political ideologies and political terminology, and also the extent to which mass media controls political engagement. But we're harkening back to a time, not necessarily a better time. This whole narrative has been a non-stop cavalcade of tragedy and illness and ignorance. But a time when it would appear upon the face of it an ethically consistent, if not necessarily morally righteous president was necessary, was favoured. So it's easy to see why he is remembered as one of the greatest presidents of all time. And what do I think of the research we've done so far? Well, I mean, it's kind of as I expected. This is a very expansive Wikipedia article. It kind of has everything you need right there. I don't feel the need to dig further into it. I don't feel the need to question the sources. This article would be tightened to... It would have been fact-checked to the nth, probably more than most other articles on Wikipedia. So we can put aside Abraham Lincoln. Now, and we're going to step now to our second leader we're going to be researching. And we took maybe a little bit too long on him. No historical figure, it is said, had there been more written about than Alexander the Great. Alexander III of Macedon. We see him here in a very Byzantine-looking mosaic. These are all like individual little tiles. Absolutely beautiful style of art called iconography. So he was born in Pella, the capital of the ancient kingdom of Macedon. He was the son of the king of Macedon and the king's fourth wife, Olympias. Philip II and Olympias, his father and his mother. Although Philip had 7 or 8 wives, Olympias was his principal wife for some time, likely because she gave birth to Alexander. So there are legends surrounding Alexander's birth. According to Plutarch, the biographer and historian, which we get a lot of these ancient histories through, Olympias dreamed that her womb was struck by a thunderbolt that caused a flame to spread far and wide before dying away. Shortly after the wedding, Philip is said to have seen himself in a dream securing his wife's womb with a seal engraved with a lion's image. These, I don't think it's necessary to read too much into interpreting these dreams or into whether they even existed. We are dealing with a history that has long since been narrativized by the time it even reached us. So, Alexander was born to the backdrop of Philip already waging wars. At the same day, the Temple of Artemis burnt down, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Wow. It is said it is burnt down because Artemis was away attending the birth of Alexander. Yeah. Such legends may have emerged when Alexander was king and possibly at his instigation at the beginning of his kingship to show that he was superhuman and destined for greatness. Yeah, that's pretty typical. The idea of the connection, the handing down from gods to kings and the divine right to rule is something that is that sweeps across many, many ancient narratives. So, he was raised by a nurse. Lady was tutored by the strict Leonidas. No, not that Leonidas. He was raised as a typical Macedonian youth, learning to read, play the lyre, fight, ride, and hunt. When he was 10 years old, they brought him a horse, and this is quite a famous story that he tamed the horse that no one else could ride, and he called it Bucephalus. He eventually named a city after his horse. Horse people, they understand. So he was educated by Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. In return for teaching Alexander, Philip agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown, which Philip had previously razed to the ground and repopulated by buying and freeing the ex-citizens who were slaves or pardoning those in exile. Oof. Guess that's what life was like. He also was acquainted with the Persian exiles at the Macedonian court. This will be relevant later. He had his eyes on Persia. So while Philip waged war against the Thracians to the north, he left Alexander, who's now 16, in charge as regent and heir apparent. During Philip's absence, perhaps sensing weakness in the young king, the Thracian tribe of Maadi revolted against Macedonia. Alexander responded quickly and drove them from their territory. You can always trust a 16-year-old to react, to react. They colonized the territory, and a city named Alexandropolis was founded. He got a taste of war. Then had a war against the Illyrians. Then he teamed up with his dad, 338 BC, and they marched south through Thermopylae. That is the location of led up to alluded to in the movie 300. That was the Battle of the Hot Gates before the larger and more important Battle of Thermopylae, where the slave-owning Greek states repelled the Persians who were trying to free slaves. I mean, that is obviously a narrativizing oversimplification, but it is relevant because it is the part that is typically left out of narratives, especially of that awful movie. Fun movie, but very deceptive. So, by this point, him and his dad are just having a good old time. The practice of murdering people on the battlefield, defeating enemies on the battlefield, was now becoming a family business. And we have here Philip commanding the right wing, Alexander the left. So we have an attentive father, though perhaps aloof, perhaps intimidating. A seemingly inattentive mother, considering he was raised by a nurse. and they were defeated the Athenians and the Thebans. He decided not to go to war with Sparta. And he established a Hellenic alliance. Philip was named Hegemon, supreme commander by this league. And he then planned to attack the Persian Empire. When Philip returned to Pella, he fell in love with and married Cleopatra Eurydice. I assume that's not. When we get to Cleopatra, we'll learn about this, whether that's the one. This put Alexander's position as heir into doubt. At the wedding of Cleopatra, whom Philip fell in love with and married, this is according to Plutarch, she being much too young for him. Already we're seeing the narrativizing of the author. This is fine though. This is an exact quote. We can learn from it. Well, you know, it is a translated quote. Her uncle Attalus, in his drink, desired the Macedonians would implore the gods to give them a lawful successor to the kingdom by his niece. This so irritated Alexander that, throwing one of the cups over his head, "You villain," said he, "what am I then, a bastard?" So this is 338 BC. So I think he's 18 at this point. No, I think he might still be 16. Yeah, that's a total 16-year-old move. "What am I, a bastard?" Then Philip, taking Attalus' part, rose up and would have run his son through, but by good fortune for them both, either his over-hasty rage or the wine he had drunk made his foot slip, that he fell down on the floor, at which Alexander reproachfully insulted over him. "See there," said he, "the man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned in passing from one seat to another." Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this never happened. Now, do I think that Alexander's place of his the legitimacy of him taking over the throne was threatened by this marriage? Absolutely. Did I think that she might have been much too young for him? That is entirely in character, unfortunately. Do I think that Alexander probably got drunk and said some dumb shit at the wedding? Entirely plausible. Philip admonished him? Entirely possible. But as for, did Philip stand up to run him through? That is perfectly in character. But him falling down on the floor and Alexander standing over him and going, "Yeah, get wrecked, scrub." I think it's far more likely that both of them fell down on the ground together and both of them said a lot of dumb shit and yelled at each other. And, well, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. We can see Plutarch clearly. Okay, so let's see. When did Plutarch live? Typically, these Greek chroniclers wrote, yeah, look at this. He was like 400 years after Alexander. If I did that math right. Yeah, pardon me, I just put an M&M in my mouth because I need to keep my sugar levels up, to keep my energy going. This is a little bit more intensive sort of stream. But what you got to understand with these sources is that Plutarch and all of these other fellas, they are writing down essentially legends. To them, to be an historian is to take the different legends that exist around the different parts of the disparate Greek city-states and to find the common threads that unify them. Or to simply pick the one that he likes the best, and that's the one he writes down. And it might not reflect any one of these myths in total, because he is not writing for the people telling these stories in marketplaces and in squares and in wine houses. And that's something we need to understand. And then there are the various steps between his original text, which usually would have been written on some kind of material like papyrus or perhaps a tablet, which is subject to destruction and deterioration. We often have often Irish monks, medieval chroniclers, the Islamic Golden Age scholars. They copy out these histories and they reach us, having many hands chosen the parts of the legend to select and which parts to leave out. Which is not to discredit them at all. It's just something we have to keep in mind every step where we tell these stories. So, anyway, next year, Alexander fled Macedon with his mother, after some shit seemed to go down at the wedding. He sought refuge with the Illyrian kings, which he had previously fought against, was treated as a guest. However, it appears Philip never intended to disown his politically and militarily trained son. So that we have a companion to ancient Macedonia. I'm going to trust that. Alexander returned after 6 months. So it's probably a whole lot of drama, family drama, and people fearing, perhaps rightfully, that they might face exile and being left out of succession. But I don't know. It's hard to say. So, Alexander looked to get married. Philip interfered, said, no, you should marry somebody better than the one you got your eye on. And Philip exiled 4 of Alexander's friends, I guess, for leading him wrong. And through the actor that Alexander sent to try to secure a wife, and threw him in jail. So we're getting a pretty good picture of the kind of fucked up world of being a royal. Not just in Macedon, but well, today as well. So the next year after that, I think he's 18 at this point, if I'm counting right. Philip was assassinated by one of his bodyguards, who was then killed while trying to escape. I was 20. I was a little bit off. Alexander was then proclaimed king on the spot. Pardon me. I'm just eating. Gotta keep my sugar levels up. So, if you're like me, you're thinking, did Alexander have anything to do with his father's death? Possible. But I'm not going to guess. I suppose by introducing the thought, I already have sort of tainted the waters a little bit, but it's just a thought I had, just based on how clearly fucked up these family dynamics were. And ironically, however fucked up they are, they probably were normal for the time, for royalty. So Alexander began by eliminating potential rivals to his throne. So, yeah, I think that this speaks potentially to the effect that his father's remarrying. We have this like kind of juxtaposition between the father and the son leading the battles together, and could have been like, the best time of Alexander's life, and then suddenly he's getting drunk and brawling with his dad at the wedding, and then he's running away to former enemies and conspiring, and now all of a sudden he's king, and he's like, oh shit, well, apparently kings get assassinated, apparently kings are bastards, so let's be a bastard so I don't get assassinated. I'm kind of narrativizing and not really expressing myself too well there. So he had his cousin executed, 2 Macedonian princes killed, spared a third. Olympias had Cleopatra, Eurydice, and Europa. Her daughter by Philip burned alive. I'm guessing that wasn't the Cleopatra then. It was, names double up. I'm sure that wasn't her. Alexander was furious when he heard about the killing of the wives and the siblings-in-law. God, this whole family is so fucked up. And then turned around and ordered the murder of Attalus, who was in command of the advance guard of the army. Oh, Jesus. Now, Attalus was at that time looking at defecting to Athens and had insulted Alexander. Alexander probably considered him too dangerous to leave alive. That seems reasonable. At least in this fucked up frame. Alexander spared Arrhidaeus, who was all accounts mentally disabled, possibly as a result of poisoning by Olympias. Man. So, news of Philip's death forced many states to revolt. What is our source here? McCarthy. Alexander the Great. Though advised to use diplomacy, Alexander, I guess wanting to relive the glory days of him and his daddy, killing people together, he raised 3,000 Macedonian cavalry and rode south to put down the Thessalian Thessalian revolt. He outmaneuvered them and they surrendered, and he added their cavalry to his force and then continued south. Stopped at Thermopylae, where he was recognized as leader of the Greek League, the Amphictyonic League, before heading back to Corinth. Athens then sued for peace, and Alexander pardoned the rebels. Ah, yes. Then there's a famous encounter between Alexander and Diogenes the Cynic. You see, Diogenes was sort of a philosopher who was... this is a pretty crazy story, but... So Diogenes was the founder of the philosophy known as Cynicism. And supposedly Diogenes owned no possessions except a spoon or something. So the story goes. Or maybe it was a fork, it doesn't matter. And he lived naked in a barrel, just rejecting all possessions. Nothing was worthwhile. And Alexander the Great comes to him and sort of looks down at this little Oscar the Grouch hanging out in his barrel and is like, I have heard that you are a wise philosopher, perhaps holding his nose from the stink emanating from this barrel as he does. And he's like, I have heard you are a wise philosopher. I am Alexander the Great. What do you want from me? Ask anything, and I shall deliver. And Diogenes looks up, the future ruler of the known world, and says, could you take a step to the left? You're standing in my light. The story goes that Alexander walked away from this encounter much wiser, but in all likelihood, he probably just kicked Diogenes' ass. So anyway, where are we up to? Alexander took the title of hegemon, supreme leader owned by his father previously. And he was appointed commander for the coming war against Persia. It's always Greece versus Persia. And he received news of a Thracian uprising. So he safeguarded his northern borders in 335 BC. He suppressed several revolts. This all before crossing to Asia. So already he is winning war after war after war. On securing his northern frontier, while he was doing that, Thebes and Athens rebelled once again. It's like the cat, you know, meows to get out, meows to get back in. They fought Thebes, and Alexander razed the city and divided the territory between the other Boeotian states. Okay, then he set out on his Asia campaign. Now here it sort of alphas the explanation that that this was to revenge against the grievances suffered by Greece and the Greece of free cities by Persia in the past. But we remember that Alexander was familiar with the Persian nobles from his youth. He rubbed elbows with them at court. So he Persia was an extremely advanced civilization at this point. The Persian cities were built according to mathematical perfection. Let me see if I can find a picture. Persian. Yeah, look at this sort of thing. Look at this. These cities would have been, this is perhaps a better one, you can sort of see the outline as to how the districts would have been set out. Like, yeah, like that's crazy. You imagine the engineering and stuff. You know, you got guys on the ground just digging a big old trench, and then there's another five guys walking around the edge, constantly taking measurements, going, nope, nope, okay, okay, a degree to the left, degree to the left, doing constant calculations. There's no aerial photography, there's no drones, there's no computers. This is just all abacus work. And they build this massive ass trench, and then in that, they just centrally plan this city of perfect lines across. Why wouldn't Alexander want all that? Very much unlike Abraham Lincoln, Alexander has grown up in privilege this whole time. He doesn't have an appreciation for the guy on the ground digging the ditch. For him, the whole world is his legacy and his succession, his legend. And for reasons we will discuss later, it doesn't appear as if Alexander is particularly interested in creating, sons to hand his little empire down to. He is more interested in creating something for himself. That's the narrative I'm telling anyway. Historians, feel free to come and tell me I'm wrong. I mean, that's what historians do, essentially. We all tell each other we're wrong, and that's how we all get better. So, he took an army of 10,000 men into Anatolia to prepare for an invasion of Asia. In 1334, crossed the Hellespont, the Straits of Gallipoli. Okay, yeah, alright, yeah. And he's crossed into Turkey. Oh, yeah, okay, that's right there. So basically, to cross into Asia, you have this point here, which that is Constantinople, also known as Istanbul. Now Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, now it's Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, now it's Constantinople. And then you can cross here. So that's the smart way. Nearly 50,000 soldiers. More than 50,000 when counting cavalry as soldiers. A fleet of 120 ships with another 38,000 crew. He showed intent to conquer the entirety of the Persian Empire. Threw a spear into the Asian soil and said he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. Which Roisman and Worthington narrativizes. He says that this expresses his eagerness to fight, Alexander's eagerness to fight, in contrast to his father's interest in diplomacy, which I would tend to agree with. So he had initial victory against the Persian forces, and he accepted. I believe I've heard of this battle. The Persians had their chariots, which were unstoppable moving forward, so they sort of split their forces to let the chariots come through and then sort of encircle them. And we had the very effective Macedonian spear formations. Phalanx. Oh no, Google, you're doing the thing. Come on. There we go. I mean, look at that for a military formation. That is cray-cray. Guys at the front have their massive lances lowered. The guys behind just in waves ready to... It's like they would call it like a spear hedge sometimes. Would have been absolutely fearsome moving forwards and also in defense. So he accepted the surrender of the Persian capital, and it must have been quite something for Alexander to head into the to now see like the beauty of the Persian cities. I mean, these were some of the most advanced cities of the time. The beauty of them, and the land was more fertile than it is now. However, as you can probably guess, this wasn't enough for Alexander. He continued laying siege, including a large scale to various cities in the Persian Empire, including a large-scale siege at Halicarnassus. He conquered city after city. Asserting control over all the coastal cities to deny the Persians naval bases. Then moved inland. Okay, so here we have something. This is a very Napoleonic thing here. There's something called the Gordian knot. It is said to have been a unsolvable knot, like a puzzle, like one of those, you know, you buy at like National Geographic shops or something, those fun puzzles. And they're said to be unsolvable. Alexander solved it by cutting it with his sword. The legend was that only the future king of Asia could solve it. Alexander just walks in and he's like, "Me smash." God. You have a similar thing in regards to Napoleon, where in Spain, I think it was, they kept a Roman glass bowl, which was said to be the Holy Grail, the cup that was used to catch the blood of Jesus in his crucifixion. And Napoleon had it brought so that he could perform a very scientific test to find out if it was indeed the Holy Grail. And he smashed it. And then concluded that obviously it was not the Holy Grail, because if it was the Holy Grail, God would have stopped him from smashing it. Yeah. Moving along. So he then moves into Levant and Syria. He was initially outmaneuvered by Darius's significantly larger army. He marched back to Cilicia and eventually defeated Darius at Issus. Darius fled and his army collapsed. Darius left behind his wife, his 2 daughters, his mother, and a fabulous treasure. Wonder what the treasure was. They offered a peace treaty that included the lands he had already lost and a ransom of 10,000 talents for his family. Well, maybe he hadn't left them behind. Alexander said, "Bro, I'm the king of Asia. Didn't you hear? I solved the knot. I get to decide the terms." And then proceeded to take possession of Syria and most of the coast of the Levant. In 332, he attacked Tyre. Big crusader sort of state. Many sieges go through here. Long and difficult siege, that is, yeah. Oh, this is the one where... Yeah, so Tyre is, and I may be mispronouncing it, but it is out on an island. And Alexander built a bridge while under attack from ships attacking his engineers and his workers. He built a land bridge to connect the city of the island with the coast so that he could conquer it. Then he massacred all the men of military age, and the women and children were sold into slavery. Yikes. Word spread of his brutality in Tyre, and most of the towns on the route to Egypt surrendered. He did have resistance at Gaza, another stronghold. It was heavily fortified and built on a hill. They told him he couldn't do it, and this just made him want to do it all the more. After 3 unsuccessful assaults, the stronghold fell, but not before Alexander received a serious shoulder wound. As in Tyre, it was a massacre. The blood mist was now taking over Alexander, and having been wounded himself, a battle wound around this time, this was something that would likely stay with you the rest of your life in some way. If not in phantom pains or in ongoing illnesses, in a psychological damage to yourself. A shoulder wound. And we don't know whether his left shoulder or his right shoulder. I could probably find that out, but I don't really care. Either way, whether it's his shield arm or his sword arm, for a warrior king, that is a psychological blow. So, he was received in Egypt as a liberator. I mean, let's be real. You'd call him a liberator too when you're the last places that resisted him, that called him an invader, ended up being put to fire on the sword. So, he was kind of like Pokemon. He was collecting the whole set of states where their leaders are sort of regarded as god kings. He was now kind of a pharaoh in his own right as well. In Europe, they sort of would have been looking for like emperor. Almost surprised he... I mean, at this time, Europe wasn't as impressive a prize as it would become in later centuries, so it's no small wonder he's focused more on Asia. So then, after leaving Egypt in 331, it's literally just like step after step, this dude is never satisfied. He marched eastward into Iraq, modern Iraq, and continued to attack Darius, who continued to flee, and he continued to pursue him. Finally, Darius fled over the mountains. Alexander captured Babylon, the traditional center of civilization. At one time regarded as the greatest city in the world by many ancient writers. Now, you could sort of argue that it's not necessarily the greatest city in the world when we talk about, for example, certain South Americans and Central American cities, but we won't get into that for now. We don't need to compete. Babylon is impressive on its own. Babylonian astronomical diaries, a series of texts, say that the king of the world, Alexander, sent his scouts with a message to the people of Babylon entering the city, "I shall not enter your houses." That's probably a smart move by his part, considering his reputation for burning down whole cities. He's kind of preceding him at this point. He would have wanted Babylon as an intact prize. So, from Babylon, still not satisfied, Alexander kept on attacking the Achaemenid capitals, capturing treasure. He stormed the Persian gates and hurried to Persepolis to loot their treasury as well. On entering Persepolis, Alexander allowed his troops to loot the city for several days, and he stayed in the city for 5 months. A fire broke out during his stay. And there have been suggestions that it was Alexander's companion who started the fire. So here's the narrativization that that as he watched the city burn, Alexander began to regret his decision. That seems to be a commonly sourced narrative. And then ordered his men to put out the fires, but the flames had already spread to most of the city. While another scholar, the Roman historian, these are all people writing hundreds of years after the fact, claims that Alexander did not regret his decision until the next morning. It was very much a drunken so whatever the truth, even the Alexander's fanboy historians are now writing of him being a little bit deranged. Plutarch recounts an anecdote in which Alexander pauses and talks to a fallen statue of Xerxes as if it were a live person. "Shall I pass by and leave you lying there because of the expeditions you led against Greece? Or shall I set you up again because of your magnanimity and your virtues in other respects. So that's a fairly deep story. It sort of suggests Alexander is sort of a man at this point in the story torn between different imperatives and different desires. Eventually, though, he did leave. He did leave Persepolis, the city in which it seems he has been immortalized as a drunken weirdo. Continuing to chase Darius into Media and Parthia. Darius, the Persian king, was taken prisoner by his own kinsmen. As Alexander approached, Bessus, who kept Darius prisoner, had his men stab the king of Persia and then had himself declared as king of Persia before he retreated in Central Asia to launch a guerrilla campaign against Alexander. Alexander then gave Darius a impressive funeral. And Alexander also claimed that Darius had named himself, Alexander, as successor to the Achaemenid throne. At this point, he is, like I said, like Pokemon cards, he is collecting crowns and prophecies. And he's able to weaponize these narratives. He's able to understand how he can use mythology. Indeed, this is the practice of kings. So, Alexander, obviously Bessus is now a threat to Alexander's legitimacy, to the Persian throne. And we know how Alexander feels about threats to his legitimacy. So he set out to defeat him in a grand tour of Asia, founding a series of new cities, all called Alexandria. Jesus Christ. This man, when will we be free of men like this? In 329. This all happened in like a decade. Bessus was betrayed. And Bessus was executed. And after another short revolt, it seemed that Persia was now Alexander's. And he began to adopt some elements of Persian dress and customs at his court, sort of taking the affectations of Great Persia. However, the Greeks were like, yo, he's gone native. They didn't like it as much. Alexander didn't seem to mind so much because he had carved himself out, at this point, one of the greatest empires. So, we have a whole bunch of politicking and difficulty in translating Achaemenid traditions to the rule of law that Alexander attempted to effect involving Alexander declaring himself a truer and greater and one of the last great or the great Achaemenid king, to attempt to push reforms, bringing him against traditionalists within Persian, Greater Persia. And there was a plot. One of Alexander's officers, Philotas, was executed for failing to alert Alexander of the plot. This is a slightly confusing paragraph. He then executed the father. So there was a fellow called Cletus the Black who had saved Alexander's life 5 years earlier. Cletus was given, his command was changed. Alexander announced a reorganization of commands in his army. Cletus then said some dumb shit while drunk to Alexander, and now we have a kind of almost kind of Freudian Alexander becoming his father. So Cletus rises up and yells at Alexander that he is not the legitimate king of the Macedonians and his achievements were due to his father. Alexander called for his guards, but they did not want to intervene in a quarrel between friends. Alexander threw an apple at Cletus and called for a dagger or a spear, but the party near the two men removed the dagger, restrained Alexander, and hustled Cletus out of the room. And then Alexander got a hold of a javelin and threw it through Cletus's heart. All the texts agree that Alexander then grieved for Cletus. So perhaps it would have been better if Alexander, like his father, in the narrativization given, fell down. I mean, it does appear that he did fall down. He was restrained by guards and friends. It's not worth it, bruv. Don't do it. But then, regardless, he got up, and he killed his friend. Now, here's where I should probably talk about. Okay. So a lot of people, especially when writing queer theories, they narrativize Alexander and Cletus as lovers. And I think it's entirely possible. I mean, it's like that meme of like, oh, and they were roommates. Historians shall know them as roommates. We call them friends, but, do I think that they fucked? Entirely possible, entirely plausible. And people sort of write Alexander the Great as like as gay in these stories. I believe I've never seen the movie Alexander that was made like 10 years ago or whenever, but I understand it's God, it must have been much more, like 15 years ago now. But see, The history of heterosexuality and homosexuality is fairly recent. We're talking in the last 200 to 300 years. The idea that sexual act determines sexual identity does not necessarily appear throughout history as in the terms that we understand it today. I don't know if I quite have the focus to get into a complete history of sexuality here, but I think I can simplify it by saying that there is a difference between a history of same-sex relations and a history of homosexuality. But I think it is perfectly plausible to say that Alexander preferred the company of men than to women. We do see this theme sort of emerge subtly through the text. And to do with, and we can create parallels. We can do what is known as reclaiming history, which is a fairly ahistorical, not necessarily academically sound practice of taking histories and relating it to our own lives to draw out the things that we want to see. The history of witchcraft is a great example of this. People, especially like modern-day neo-pagans and many like second-wave feminists, have reclaimed the idea of the witch as a symbol of female empowerment. And the actual history is far, far more complicated. And it really doesn't hold up to that kind of narrativization. But there is value. Because at the end of the day, Alexander is dead. And he is never coming back. And while historians have an ethical and professional obligation to report the facts as they actually are, the average person on the street does not. And if you want to claim Alexander as a gay icon, then, like, go for it. Personally, and I suspect that yourself as well, having heard some of the quite brutal massacres he officiated over, and his increasing instability, I feel like there are better people we can claim. Nonetheless, it is a desire. It is a natural thing we have to look back through the past and say, you know, ut erimus et fuimus, as it was, so it shall be. We want to find images of ourselves deep in the past, and that gives us legitimacy in the present. It's something that pretty much every civilization has done. Medieval chroniclers drew people in contemporary fashion so they could see themselves reflected in the past. But you know me. My philosophy? ¿Por qué no los dos? Why can't we have both? We can accept Alexander as a queer icon in a tongue-in-cheek way, while simultaneously acknowledging that he was kind of a piece of shit, but without, you know, cancelling him. Why do our gay icons all have to be good people? He certainly was a complex man, born into an extraordinarily unstable position of incredible privilege. And personally, I don't feel a great deal of sympathy for him in that state. But it is certainly interesting. It is certainly interesting. And even today, he is a man that more books have been written about him than perhaps any other person in history. He is the most studied man in history. So, the man Alexander, not only is he dead and gone and never coming back, so we don't have to worry about hurting his feelings by misrepresenting him, but he is already lost to history. There is no more Alexander. There is only a series of mythologies, and that is the man that he built by being able to adopt and control mythologies, by he seemed to understand that the narrative was the way to immortality. And he is the historian's king. No small wonder that he is so narrativized that everybody wants to claim him as their own. Personally, I think it is a little reductive to equate our modern sensibilities onto the past. And I think it's important to be critical of these things. I remember my sister, when she was in high school, she wrote like a history of gay people, and she sort of started with Alexander the Great. And when I said to her, I was studying history at university at the time, she was in high school, and I said to her, you realize like same-sex relationships and homosexuality aren't the same thing, and she just got like really shitty at me. Really nasty. And, a passive-aggressive rather than an aggressive way or anything, but it's kind of how it is. People get very attached to our stories. And being an historian, God, you better believe historians in Australia have been like followed by spy agencies to make sure that they're not, perverting national narratives by writing about socialism, and historians receive death threats. And it's kind of an extension of the culture war. So I guess what I'm trying to say, on one hand, is that studying history is one of the most important pursuits we can have. And on the other hand, we have to understand that what we're dealing with here, although we deal with the best historical sources, the truth is not what is on the pages, but what is between the pages. Once things that we become better able to draw out of the narrative, once we are familiar with the patterns of narrativization. And this is a constantly evolving process. What my generation creates, yours will tear down and question. And then out of the ashes of what is left, you find the things that work best for you. And in that, we find a truth. And that is the truth that is best for the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And that's a fairly technocratic, proceduralist perspective, but it is one that will do for now. Because I can't do justice to every philosophical approach, at least right now, at least not in a diversion, when I'm meant to be speaking about Alexander the Great. So, TLDR. Alexander the Great, gay or nah? Technically, nah. But does it really matter? Alexander the Great, fuck dudes, almost certainly. I mean, probably everybody did, right? I mean, if you really want to get technical about it, homosexuality predates heterosexuality. It's like, like which came first, safety or danger? Well, why we need a term for safety if we don't have a term for danger? Anyway, moving on. So, to the backdrop of a whole bunch. We're reaching the end of the story of Alexander. So there's a whole bunch of politicking and going on in Alexander's court, and rulership does not really seem to be Alexander's forte. We're starting to see a pattern emerge that when he isn't marching forward, when he isn't taking his army to conquer a new land, he's kind of getting drunk and doing dumb shit. So, after a number of reforms and introducing coinage to better facilitate trade across his new empire, Alexander turned his attention to India. Starting to encourage leaders in Afghanistan and Pakistan to submit to his authority. Some agreed, some did not. So, those that joined accompanied Alexander as he then went to war with the others. That's the pattern we see with Alexander. He keeps his army keeps getting bigger and bigger as he keeps rolling up new forces. Keeps moving forward. So he continued to conquer into the Punjab region. Just for context, yeah, so you can see it goes through. This is just along the way. He's basically with his back to the mountains, taking the northern part of India. There is a legend, there's a story about when Alexander enters India, he sees monkeys and he thinks that these monkeys are people, and he sends diplomats to sort of offer to negotiate peace with these monkeys. And God knows whether it's actually true, but having crossed half the known world and seeing strange sights, now entering a different sort of a climate, you can sort of see how people would think that they are entering, almost a new world. So, pushing further and further into India, his army is exhausted by campaigning. I mean, it has been non-stop. There would have been disease, The climate is different. Would have been thick jungle they would have been traveling through at this point. Very different to marching across deserts and across the rocky areas, the rocky terrain of Greece and Macedon. Alexander's army refused to march further. According to Plutarch, as for the Macedonians, however, their struggle with Porus blunted their courage and stayed their further advance into India. For having had all they could do to repulse an enemy who mustered only 20,000 infantry and 2,000 horse, they violently opposed Alexander when he insisted on crossing the river Ganges. Also, the width of which they learned was 6.4 kilometers, its depth 180 meters, while its banks on the further side were covered with multitudes of men-at-arms and horsemen and elephants. But they were told that the kings of the Gandarites and the Praeslii were awaiting them with 80,000 horsemen, 2,000 footmen, 8,000 chariots, and 6,000 war elephants. Alexander tried to persuade his men to go further. But Alexander eventually agreed to their representatives and turned south, marching along the Indus. They conquered a few other places, including Alexander suffering another injury. He sent much of his army to southern Iran, and commissioned a fleet to explore the Persian Gulf. The rest made it back to Persia through the more difficult southern route. He arrived in 324 back in Persia, but he lost many of his men to the harsh desert along the way. Upon returning, he executed many of his military governors who had misbehaved in his presence. And after a brief revolt, possibly over ongoing unhappiness over him adopting Persian customs, he had a largely symbolic mass marriage of his senior offers to Persian and other noblewomen. But it doesn't seem like these marriages stuck. So his attempts to sort of create peace and understanding between Greece, Macedonia, and Persia doesn't seem to have worked. Afterwards, Alexander traveled to his friend and possible lover. That's what we were sort of getting on before. Died of illness or poisoning. Hephaestion's death devastated Alexander. And yeah, I do think it was his lover. I think Alexander took many, many lovers. And it does appear more men than women. In 323. So how old would he have been at this point? So Alexander was born 356. At the age of 33. God. Talk about an overachiever. There are two different accounts of Alexander's death. Plutarch's account is that roughly 14 days before his death, Alexander entertained Admiral Nearchus and spent all night and day drinking with Medius of Larissa. Probably fucking do. Alexander developed a fever which worsened until he was unable to speak. The common soldiers, anxious about his health, were granted the right to file past him as he silently waved at them. Jeez. In the second account, Diodorus recounts that Alexander was struck with pain after downing a large bowl of unmixed wine in honor of Hercules, followed by 11 days of weakness. He did not develop a fever, instead dying in some agony. Now, of these two accounts, I think the second sounds more plausible. Men die in agony, and after a life of debauchery, his liver giving out or something like that seems entirely possible. Dude had a hard life. He probably had a lifetime, 33 years of eating like abysmal trail food. He lived the life of, the best life a soldier could live, but still the life of a soldier. And the life and 33 was honestly a good time for him to live, essentially waging war since he was 16 years old. The other account of him falling weak after a mysterious illness and his soldiers all sort of filing past him as he feebly waves at them. I think that there is a certain amount of narrativization in this one as well. I think it's attempting to sort of strike a balance, perhaps, between saying, he was so beloved by his soldiers. Despite we know that just before his soldiers had been revolting over him adopting Persian customs. But it seems plausible that aspects of both happened. Or it is perhaps even more plausible that neither are true. But we can understand things from both narratives as they reflect the worlds in which the narratives were written. A world which by this point had been immeasurably reshaped by Alexander. Here is another narrativized bit here from Oldark, Richard Oldark, and R.M. Benitez. A Mysterious Death. Medical, New England Journal of Medicine. So not a historian, but probably an interesting paper all the same. The anguish that Alexander felt after Hephaestion's death may have contributed to his declining health. He died of a broken heart. Will we ever know? No. We're never going to know what killed Alexander. So, His body was laid in a gold anthropoid. I don't know that word. I assume it means human-shaped? Resembling a human in form. There you go. Sarcophagus that was filled with honey, honey, very important to Persians, I believe. When you think about it, when you live in the desert, you know, this amazing sweet nectar that is both comes from plants and animals. I mean, what greater expression of the gods could you see than that? In a lot of Islamic countries, honey is still very culturally significant. Australian honey is actually very sought after. So the sarcophagus was then, the gold sarcophagus filled with honey, with his body in it, was then placed in a gold casket. A seer foretold that the land where Alexander would lay to rest would be happy and unvanquishable forever. Perhaps more likely, the successors may have seen the possession of the body as a symbol of legitimacy, since burying their prior king was a royal prerogative. Yeah. That's a narrativization I agree with. Yeah. And when we have seers say stuff like this, we don't just go, ooh, I'm an atheist on Reddit. All of these people who believe in spirits are dumb. We look at the truth behind it. And this is speaking to a truth that would be recognizable to anyone. That whoever raises the tomb of Alexander, they tie their history to Alexander forever. So while Alexander's body was on its way to Macedon, Ptolemy seized it and took it to Memphis. His successor, Ptolemy II, transferred it to Alexandria, where it retained until late antiquity. Ptolemy IX replaced Alexander's sarcophagus with a glass one so that he could convert the original to coins. And the recent discovery of an enormous tomb in northern Greece, dating from the time of Alexander the Great, has given rise to the speculation that its original intent was to be the burial place of Alexander, where they wanted to put him. This would fit with the original destination of Alexander's funeral. However, the memorial was found to be dedicated to Hephaestion, Alexander's dearest friend. And they were roommates. Continuing of other kings. You know, like Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. They visited the tomb in Alexandria. Augustus allegedly knocked the nose off. Caligula was said to have taken Alexander's breastplate from the tomb for his own use. It was eventually closed off to the public. After this, the fate of the tomb are hazy. Yeah, this bit is interesting. Augustus knocked the nose off Alexander the Great. Accidentally knocked the nose off. Yeah, no. That... It might have happened. I mean... If we've learned anything from this, it's that monarchs are horrible people who have no respect for history except as it relates to them. But we look at the narrative there. Augustus knocking the nose off Alexander's face. It's like, roll over Beethoven. Look out, there's a new king of the world in town. That is the, other kings visit his tomb to seek their own legitimacy for their rule. But at the same time, you can also go there and kind of, piss all over it and be like, yo, I'm better. Disrespect is a tool that you can use. Caligula taking Alexander's breastplate, that just, I don't know, Caligula was an absolute madman. Caligula was insane. So he was seeking the same thing, but I don't know, that kind of feels crazy to me. For his own use. Probably drinking wine out of it. So, Alexander's death was so sudden that when reports of his death reached Greece, they were not immediately believed. And, sorry, just gotta touch something. Go into my edit, go into my stuff here. Sorry about that. I'm right back. Just had a little technical issue. Alright. Where was I? Ah, yes. The Macedonians did not initially believe that Alexander was dead, and he had no obvious or legitimate heir. His son Alexander IV being born after Alexander's death. According to Diodorus, Alexander's companions asked him on his deathbed whom he bequeathed his kingdom. His reply was, "To the strongest." Another theory is that his successors willfully or erroneously misheard to Craterus, the general leading his Macedonian troops. Arrian and Plutarch claimed that Alexander was speechless by this point, implying that this was an apocryphal story. Diodorus, Curtius, and Justin offered the more plausible story that Alexander passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, a bodyguard and leader of the Companion cavalry. I mean, it sort of makes sense that he would want to hand it to a soldier rather than a politician, considering his relationship with other kings and court officials throughout this story has been quite shaky, to say the least. So, Perdiccas initially did not claim power, instead claiming that Roxane's baby would be king. The infantry rejected this arrangement, and they supported Alexander's half-brother. And after the birth of the baby Alexander IV, he and Philip III were appointed joint kings in name only. Dissension and rivalry emerged almost immediately. Perdiccas was assassinated a few years later, and 40 years of war between the successors ensued before the world settled into 4 stable power blocks: Egypt, Mesopotamia in Central Asia, Anatolia, and Macedon. In the process, both Alexander IV and Philip III were murdered. So Alexander earned the epithet the Great due to his unparalleled success as a military commander. He never lost a battle despite being typically outnumbered. A part of that is knowing when to fight. I mean, he would retreat from many a battle rather than engage. And that's just good sense. Use of terrain, phalanx and cavalry tactics, bold strategy, and the fierce loyalty of his troops. Probably because he was fucking them. I'm going to leave that point again for now. Yeah. Let's see what it says about his personality, because that's kind of interesting, because that's sort of related to the history of which I've been speaking. Both of his parents encouraged his ambitions. His father was probably Alexander's most influential role model, as I said, with the young Alexander watching him campaign practically every year, winning victory after victory while ignoring severe wounds. Okay, a little bit of narrativizing happening here. I very much doubt he was ignoring severe wounds, but he was certainly putting an affectation of strength. Probably, I would suspect, absolutely domineering and terrifying the young Alexander. His relationship with his father forged the competitive side of his personality. He had need to outdo his father, illustrated by his reckless behavior in battle. Yeah? When Alexander worried that his father would leave him no great or brilliant achievement to be displayed to the world, he also downplayed his father's achievements to his companions. His mother had huge ambitions as well. Yeah, as evidenced by the amount of people she had killed just to secure their lineage. And encouraged her son to believe it was his destiny to conquer the Persian Empire. She instilled a sense of destiny in him. They got some narrativization here. We don't know what is in his head, but, these are fine. This is fine. I don't really see a problem with this. And Plutarch tells how his ambition kept his spirit serious and lofty in advance of his years. I mean, to be fair, he didn't have that many years anyway. Alexander had a violent temper and rash, impulsive nature. I believe it. Although Alexander was stubborn and did not respond well to orders from his father, he was open to reasoned debate. He had a calmer side. Desire for knowledge, a love of philosophy, and an avid reader. No doubt due to Aristotle's tutelage. Yeah, Aristotle was kind of like an insufferable prat in a way. He would have been like he's kind of like one of the worst debate bros you could imagine. I'm probably going to get some classical history people getting mad at me for this, but Yeah, that's how I see it. So, no wonder he would raise such a brat as Alexander. He had great self-restraint in pleasures of the body, in contrast with his lack of self-control with alcohol. Yeah, that was written in 1976. I can see some anti-gay panic narrativization there. I have no evidence to suggest that except for a counter narrative, but it is yeah, let's leave that one hanging. He had no interest in the Olympic Games, unlike his father. Yeah, for him, games was like killing people. During his final years, and especially after the death of Hephaestion, I would say leading back to his first war injuries, the dispelling of the idea that he was like sort of immortal, and also his conquering Persia and his not life sort of not immediately falling into a kind of a perfection that would have fucked him up. I mean, this is a dude who was raised to think that his destiny was all leading to a single point, and when that point arrives, obviously he is not going to find. Obviously, when that point arrives, he is going to find that his insecurities and his fears and his inadequacies still exist. His unique abilities were further demonstrated by the inability of his generals to rule Macedonia. Only Alexander had to do so. I don't think that necessarily represents his abilities as a statesman as it does the fact that he is Alexander. I mean, look at how people like worship Elon Musk no matter how dumb shit he does. How much dumb shit he does. And he does a lot of dumb shit. He is. Elon Musk is not clever, but people treat him like a modern day Iron Man, like a Tony Stark. He's like the dumb man, smart man. You got a kind of a cult of personality. So Alexander, megalomania and paranoia. I totally believe it. And I think that I don't think that these are traits that emerged. I think it's far more likely that this is his personality. The megalomania was instilled in him from birth. And the paranoia, that was a deep trauma instilled in him by the insecurity of his position in life. You see, fled his father's empire and damn near joined with his enemies just over a few drunken insults. I mean, to be fair, that was some pretty serious business. As we've seen with Alexander, a few drunken insults can lead to people getting killed. But yeah, dude was a complicated, messed up man. And it's kind of tragic in a way. I mean, he's kind of running from his problems his whole life by running towards his accomplishments. That's how I read this. He is described by various sources as having boundless ambition. That's certainly the nicest way you could put it. Frequently, our ambitions and such are representatives, are expressions of our deeply held internal insecurities. He appears to have believed himself a deity or sought to deify himself, and yet his body kept being pierced by spears, and his soul kept being damaged by the deaths and the betrayals of his friends, and his heart kept being broken. And in the middle of the night, he would wake up, probably to growing stomach pains over years and years of drinking, and he would wake up each morning after debauchery and drinking to find himself a weak, sick man. His mother told him he was the son of Zeus. So yeah, that's Alexander the Great, the most written about man in history. Honestly, I kind of feel sorry for him. I mean, I feel sorry for him, but at the same time, I don't really have sympathy for him, if you know what I mean. He was a bad dude. I mean, he had to be a bad dude. He was born into a world of murder and assassination and insecurity, and, you know, he kind of had to be a bad dude to survive. But he kind of managed to weave the stories of history and to turn bad into badass. And these things are separated only by a paper-thin distinction. Perhaps bad isn't the right narrative frame. He was weak. He was weak and he was fearful, and his fear drove him to be courageous, and his weakness drove him to be strong. Just like everybody else. Just like you or I. Sure, we don't conquer half the known world, but given the opportunity, maybe we would. So that's my take. That's my take of a close-up of the icon that is Alexander the Great. He's even got the kind of sad face here. Look at that. Is he an anime character? Like, look at the size of those eyes. I don't think an anime character has ever had a nose this big, though. Oh, except maybe for a One Piece character. But anyway. So, yeah, we kind of fell down a rabbit hole here with Alexander. And we ended up only getting 2 leaders done today. I don't want to push it. I don't want to overwhelm myself. These are quite much more mentally intensive streams than just playing a video game. And I think that perhaps I should be aiming for slightly shorter streams from this point. I noticed that rewatching my VOD of yesterday's stream, about 2 hours in, I think I overloaded my video memory and everything kind of felt, the quality fell a lot and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, excuses, excuses, excuses. From here, onwards and upwards. And we'll be continuing these research streams, working our way ever so slowly down the list. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're rewatching the VOD on YouTube right now, I see you there. And I appreciate you too. I love you all so very much. And swoop swoop, take care of one another.